Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. I don't feel like talking now. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me? All right, in the back? Okay, just let me know if at any point you can't. No, thank you so much. I'm starting with the acknowledgement slide in the sciences, right? People usually save that for the end, but I'm going to start because I want to express gratitude first to the Rachel Carson Center and to the chance to be here, to think about these things, both on my own and in a space that's communal, intellectual, and congenial. So Christoph, thank you so much. And all the staff, the other fellows, the students, I've had wonderful conversations with a number of the students already. And I also want to, where's Carmen? I think let's a round of applause for Carmen, who I think is the person keeping us all going here. So thank you. In various non-pilot versions of my life, I worked in universities, staff positions, and I know how irritating professors can be. So my gratitude to Carmen and all the staff. So it's wonderful to be here. And I just also want to briefly acknowledge some other support for this project. It's not under contract, and that's partly by design and partly not. But I had a residency at UCross in Wyoming to work on this project. The Udall Center for Public Policy at the University of Arizona was the first to sort of, if not support the ideas that I'm going to float here, at least supporting the possibility of giving me time to do that. And then these additional entities, so I wish to thank all of them. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to cut things a little short if we're running out of time. So as Christoph said, the book is called Atlas of the Long Tomorrow, Radical Engineers, A Forgotten Journey, and Our Quest for a Better World. And I thought, especially because we have English as my native tongue, but not necessarily yours, I thought I would give you a little snapshot slide of sort of what I think this book is about, understanding that it's still very much in process. I've worked on this book off and on. The Fallen Sky came out in 2009. I had a contract for a different project. That didn't go. I broke that contract and sort of moved around different ideas and came to this one over the past 2 or 3 years in a more coherent fashion. And actually, I don't tell the story. I won't today, but Christoph mentioned Martha, the Last Passenger Pigeon, and I wrote a magazine piece for Orion in 2014, the centennial of her death, and some conversations, and I can talk about this later if you're interested, some conversations with some of the editorial staff there about what the message should be thinking about the extinction of this bird again. As you'll hear, I'm trying to take a different tack, at least as a thought experiment. So what is this book about? Well, I'm adopting a posture of technological optimism after years of environmental despair, being open to aspirations and doubts. Okay, so it is a thought experiment. It's like I'm putting on this jacket of technological optimism, and like, what does that mean? So I need to provide a history of it, and I realized here, actually in the past week, that I need to have a character focus, and that will probably be H.G. Wells. And then telling the story, and of course Wells, he spans, it's an interesting time because he spans the height of the Industrial Revolution. He doesn't die until 1946. So he's alive during the Great Depression. And I need here then to tell the story of lowercase technocracy, okay, and we can talk about what I mean by that in the Q&A, but especially the uppercase or capitalized technocracy, which was a radical movement in the Great Depression era of the United States with two main factions, and I'll say a little bit, actually we'll open with a discussion, some history of this movement. Has anybody heard of the technocracy movement in the 1930s? So, one person, yeah. There's, I think, just one scholar writing about them today. So, and they were asking the questions that we asked today. So I wanted to have this historical braid. So I'm going to draw a line from these precursors to today's eco-modernists, those concerned about democracy and governance, in the Anthropocene and at a time of diminishing scientific literacy. And then, so this is a lot of and thens, so I have some structural issues I'm thinking about while I'm here in terms of bringing all this together as a book project. These 6 heretical technologies, and my original conception for the book was that I would just be doing this, that I was going to do a kind of tour of these technologies, okay? So next generation nuclear power, climate engineering, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, sort of more here and now things, and then getting increasingly speculative. This is where the rockets come in. De-extinction. There is a project at the University of California, sponsored by Stuart Brand of the Long Now Foundation, to bring a version of the passenger pigeon back. Human enhancement, post-humanism, and space settlement. You know, what happens if Elon Musk builds his city on Mars? So that was the core of this, but coming to it then through this historical braid helps me ground this, I think, historicize it, and have a sort of wider palette, as it were. So I'm going to read now from the opening of the book. I'm calling it a prologue, and after yesterday's discussion in the Works in Progress meeting, I don't know if I should call it a prologue or chapter 1, but it is the opening of the book, and it begins with a scene reconstruction of this technocracy movement trying to revive itself after World War II. So I begin with that history. I move into the questions that they were asking that I think are still the questions we have today, and then I move into sort of a more personal mode. So just so you can kind of keep track of where I'm going. Okay, and still good on the sound? Carrying okay? All right, great. So this is called pattern exhaustion. Pattern exhaustion. On a bright summer day in 1947, the self-described engineer, for he was not actually an engineer, and the aspiring leader of something called the North American Technate, should it ever come to pass, a man named Howard Scott, walked past a skein of dull gray cars and trucks waiting to cross from Washington State to Canada. Tall, wearing a double-breasted suit the color of the vehicles, Scott waved stiffly to a movie camera belonging to his organization, Technocracy Incorporated. The gray was deliberate. It was the movement's official color, the suit the official uniform. If Scott gave the organization's army-like salute, the film doesn't show it, but we see how gusts caught his jacket and tie, his face remaining in shadow. Despite the long line of member vehicles extending 10 miles as part of something called Operation Columbia, many with Scott's name boldly printed on rooftop placards, Technocracy Incorporated had seen far more promising days. Near the beginning of the Great Depression, before the New Deal took hold, the United States and the world were being ripped apart by economic and political violence. Fears rose that civil wars, revolutions, and global conflict were nigh. In England, in the autumn of 1931, members of the Royal Navy staged a mutiny at Invergordon, protesting cuts in salary. The government trembled, suspecting widespread insurrection. Like ice on hot pans, banks across the United States and Europe were dissolving into bankruptcy. Japan abandoned gold as its currency standard while its military occupied Manchuria. At the White House, there were hunger marches despite a massive wheat harvest. The harvest had crashed prices so severely that farmers left their land to seek work in the city, work that proved illusory. Nearly a quarter of the American workforce would become jobless. President Hoover and Congress were deemed increasingly feckless, but the latter did designate the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem. In a few months, the president would have slums named after him. The instantly iconic, and to millions in fear and poverty, taunting symbols of civic and economic prowess, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and the George Washington Bridge were opened or completed by the dismal fall of 1931. Perhaps it's appropriate that one of the hit films that year was about a vampire, Dracula, a rich count no less, and another about a mad scientist toying with the laws of nature, Frankenstein. In those dark months, Howard Scott and other self-professed technocrats briefly, excitedly, and in their way presciently dominated the national conversation over issues of unemployment, corporate and civic corruption, energy efficiency, poverty in a world of abundance, and the pace of technological change. Concerns relevant to the point of crisis, well into our own faltering era. After an electrifying presentation to, of all things, the American Statistical Association, followed by a frenzy of reports on Scott's prediction of imminent social collapse and inevitable technocratic renaissance, it appeared to some that this imposing, tough-talking prophet, or perhaps some other less abrasive personality, might lead a rational revolution, might even become dictator, ushering in a continental government by science, ranging from the Arctic to Central America, transforming this part of the planet into, if not a utopia, then something more sustainable and more just than the monstrous inequity and rapaciousness that then and still largely characterized democracy and capitalism. For the technocratic movement, which was larger than Scott's organization, and I should say there's a whole history here going back at least as far as the 19th century, which I won't go into here. For the technocratic movement, which was larger than Scott's organization, the future belonged to a world run by engineers, by technicians, by scientists, whose dispassionate expertise would deliver the greatest good to the greatest number. Capitalism and democracy were obsolete, they argued, even dangerous. So, more than a decade after the Depression, after the technocratic revolution had failed to materialize, and after the frightening but energizing Second World War had all but sidelined Technocracy Incorporated, the enigmatic Howard Scott led much of what was left of the group in the largest peaceful mobilization in U.S. history. Operation Columbia filled lecture halls, reaching tens of thousands of people with Scott's long-standing messages, dire warnings about jobs lost to automation and the need to abolish currency in favor of energy certificates that would reflect the precise number of kilowatt hours used to make something, certificates that included no profit markup and that would be distributed to everyone as a kind of basic national income. And of course, we're talking about basic national income more and more, even in the United States. And this idea of energy certificates rather than money, currency, has been revived in Masdar City, which is the first effort to create a zero-carbon metropolis on the planet. So, meant to herald the return of Technocracy Incorporated, this tour of orators, complete with a searchlight, car-mounted loudspeakers, a squad of motorcycles, road signs with the Technocracy symbol, which was a red and white yin and yang, connoting the balance between production and consumption, and even an airplane banking overhead, and the hundreds and hundreds of cars. All of this failed to attract a single national press report. This, after the heyday of the early 1930s, when coverage in newspapers and magazines had for a few months been relentless. Hundreds of articles had appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, other newspapers, and books appeared overnight, trying but often failing to clarify the confusing term technocracy and its implications. Was it communist? Was it fascist? How would the technocrats take over? By election? By gunpoint? That was then. In 1947, unless you had been there, Operation Columbia didn't happen. In retrospect, it's remarkable that it gathered as many participants and listeners as it did. For Scott had fallen in 1932 from the zenith of his national prominence with terrible speed, criticized by industrial titans and Marxists alike, exposed to personal scandal by reporters, abandoned by his former allies, including a prominent group of Columbia University engineers and academics. At one point, Scott claimed he had been drugged before a national radio address. Xenophobic, anti-Catholic, coarse, and militaristic, Scott turned himself and his uppercase Technocracy Incorporated into the butt of national jokes. And I want to pause here, I wasn't going to mention this, but I just filled out a Freedom of Information Act request. In the United States, you can, to get classified material, and the FBI had these groups under surveillance. Just to give you an idea, we don't remember these groups at all. They have 17,000 pages of material on this guy. So I don't know how quickly I'll be able to get to that. So he was considered a threat, and the other technocrats as well. So this tainted all the various splinter technocratic movements, including one led by a far more thoughtful and equally forgotten rival, Harold Loeb, a wealthy Princeton-educated man of letters who edited a little magazine called Broom and hung out with the giants of modernism. Loeb would one-up Scott, however, in actually trying to describe the technocratic future in a book called Life in a Technocracy, What It Might Be Like. Presumably, it would have more colors than gray, especially since Loeb envisioned voluntary steps toward new kinds of biologically altered human beings. Eventually, Scott's organization, having outlived his competitors, would leave its fancy New York City headquarters and become a stack of boxes and files in a barn in Pennsylvania. Today, it's an obscure corner of the internet with ancient videos resembling 1990s public access cable TV shows. And their technocracy and similar extinct organizations would remain. Studied off and on by a few scholars, a largely forgotten movement with its forgotten 1947 journey, its failed resurrection, both colorful and curious, were it not for the troubling fact that everything the technocrats questioned about 1930s North America is everything we question about the world today. How do we measure the worth of an object of our labor? How can there be privation when we have the capacity to feed, clothe, tend, and educate everyone right now, everywhere, so that human creativity can be freed from the bonds of subsistence? How can capitalism be saved from itself if it can? In the 1930s, there was talk of secular stagnation, used to describe an economy fundamentally at odds with itself, slowing, dying, one that could never provide enough jobs for the population. And this question, are politics irredeemably corrupt? In a world that is warmer, stranger, and faster, we have our new and dangerous variations on these questions. One is this: how can democracy function in a climate that is growing literally and socially more extreme and that will get worse before it gets better if it does? If democracy is broken, how can we fix the planet? Anti-rationalism threatens everyone and everything. To begin the Anthropocene with the death of the Enlightenment is like starting to cross the ocean after killing the navigator. The timing could not be worse. A few years ago, Britain's Royal Society declared in a report on climate engineering that unchecked carbon emissions threaten an end not only to the contemporary biosphere, but to civilization as we know it. So breathe that in. I've been haunted by that passage about the too soonness of our inevitable extinction, so calmly set in type on a page, preceded by a page, and followed by a page, our possible end. I believe that a technocratic imperative and our quest for a better world may go hand in hand. I'm writing this book in order to test that hypothesis. We can't create perfect worlds, but we can improve our own, and by our, I don't mean just human. It's time to draw some new lines from Thomas More's Utopia up to the Industrial Revolution's versions of ideal societies, including a now obscure novel by one Edward Bellamy that was so compelling it became a kind of movement, to the warfare-stricken concerns of H.G. Wells, onward through Technocracy Incorporated, then to the violent dreams of the radicals of 1968, to today's environmentally inflected utopian thinking, including something called eco-modernism, which seeks, among other things, greater and greener energy, smarter and denser urbanization, and intensified agriculture in order to feed and shelter billions of people seeking a good standard of living, while also leaving vast tracts of wild nature alone. Eco-modernism seeks to minimize negative human impact on the non-human world by decoupling the economy from the environment through increased efficiencies. Eco-modernism also seeks to increase human control of the entire biosphere in order to make that happen. Out of such a paradox may come, as eco-modernists like to say, a good or even great Anthropocene, in which the marks we've made on the world, a warmer atmosphere, an acid ocean, mines the eye can spot from space, isn't a scar, but more of a peace symbol. New forests, better cities, renewed species. Not everyone would agree. Critics of our already technologically saturated moment, like the so-called uncivilization, dark mountain, or dark ecology movement, scholars of degrowth, have legitimate worries about solving modernity's various crises with more modernity. They worry about greenwashing. They worry about the sense of global north white male privilege that modernity has implied and helps to keep in place. They worry about unforeseen consequences of technologies, including some, like nuclear power, that eco-modernists explicitly or implicitly endorse. Along with their philosopher and poet sources, such as Martin Heidegger and Robinson Jeffers, the Dark Mountain school of thought thinks modernity is simply about ordering and efficiency and consumption, means that are also ends, all to no higher purpose. Dark ecology activists, like, ironically, much of the populist right wing, distrust elites, especially tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, with their bewildering and powerful alloy of green innovation and profit motive. In any case, what passes for democracy in many places, including the United States, evidence-based thinking and decision-making have given way to kleptocratic schemes and thoughtless ideological divisions in which even the possibility of agreements about the existence of information or of a problem, let alone solutions, is impossible. Fake news and fake democracy go hand in hand. Democracy has become a wicked problem. And here, I have some things to say about Parag Khanna, who's a globalization scholar in Singapore, and he talks about technocracy and democracy in ways to sort of bring data and public accountability together in sort of more novel forms of governance, which is something I have a lot yet to learn about. But back to the 1930s. Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, in his book, The Age of Roosevelt, dismissed the technocracy movement of that era as caught between ribaldry and irrelevance and doomed to disappear as rapidly as it had arisen. But he also says that it helped to foster a sense of infinite technological possibility, a susceptibility to new approaches, and a readiness to break with the past. In such strange origins and contours, one might find hope, which I don't counsel, or a kind of working optimism, which I do. That seems better than the paralyzed despair, even when in action, that has marked much of my intellectual and civic life and much of the so-called environmental movement of which I've been a part. As the poet Lisa Robertson writes in a piece called Utopia, yes, the future, which is a sowing motion, so is memory. The hot summers of the late 1980s, the scientist James Hansen suddenly in the news speaking of this new thing, the greenhouse effect. I remember those days. Newspapers and magazines spread before me with charts of predicted temperature rise, and beside them, my newly purchased field guides to North American birds. My awakening to the natural world through birdwatching began with my fear that nature was already vanishing. There was so little time to find common yellowthroats and enact 50 simple things you could do to save the earth. Raised on disaster movies, atomic explosions, alien invasions, in a family that was itself a disaster, that's what I'd come to expect. Still, I became an activist, wanting to write in the world my own fable for tomorrow. Not Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, but a season of sublime wonder at the natural world and a rational culture of science-based decisions. I was in my 20s. And I remained a believer, fueled by hope and no small amount of self-loathing, helping to fight corporate hog farms and four endangered species, like a little fish I never actually saw while I lived in Kansas, called the Topeka shiner. But again and again, everything that I believed was possible, everything big I thought we were on the brink of, has failed. Whatever success local groups may have had in my activist years in Kansas and Utah, and whatever success they and others elsewhere have today, they are getting swamped in the tsunami of heat and extreme weather that has come far faster than anyone suspected was possible. Recent work tells us we have until mid to late century before we reach a world so unrecognizable it will make recent record-hot seasons seem clement in comparison. Hope, the dictionary tells us, is to want something to happen or be true, or think that it could happen or be true, and that is its dangerous allure. We get our hopes up. When they fall down again and again over 3 decades, they get bruised or worse. We've been witnessing a decades-long, colossal biospheric fail. There's a term from anthropology that's been haunting me of late, pattern exhaustion. It's when an ancient culture that has been using a certain form of pottery abandons it, as though the people were simply bored, as though they needed a new aesthetic, though the goal remained the same: make vessels to contain what is needed. Over the past few years, I've suffered from a kind of pattern exhaustion. I began to realize it when I re-engaged on climate issues after 8 years of trying hard to ignore them. You could probably guess which 8 years that was. I began to feel it when I found myself driving on unseasonably warm spring days in places like Utah and California, where my lived moments picked up signals from the geologic time the American West lays bare. I began to articulate it when I spoke with scientists, thinkers, and writers and dissidents about what there's left to try to do, and when I rediscovered a sense of belonging that embraced both the non-human world and the technological sublime. The fundamental social question of our time may be this: what if instead of head-against-the-wall activism, letters, marches, lobbying, and what if instead of international climate negotiation bureaucracies that have produced no actual reduction in global greenhouse emissions, we explore something more potent and, yes, something more dangerous? What if an array of technologies, nuclear power, climate engineering, synthetic biology, human enhancement, de-extinction, and terraforming have the potential to shepherd the biosphere through the contemporary catastrophes of the Anthropocene? So we don't have 50 simple things to do. We may have a few very complicated things to consider. What if the short-term technological tools of capitalism might actually help preserve that which we call nature and help lift billions more people out of poverty? What if these projects returned capitalism to a focus on infrastructure, taming it with a governmental social contract, turning it away from the contemporary fetish with credit and debt-driven financial speculation? Capitalism and environmentalism are both neurotic, one seeking to stay alive by hoarding, the other by exempting. Both see nouns instead of verbs. Ironically, advanced technologies, everything from synthetic biology to human enhancement, are process technologies. They are cyborg ecological. They stand against fixity. Fixity, whether of assets or park boundaries, being maybe anti-ecological. And what if these technologies are harnessed most effectively by some variant of the technocracies I'm obsessed with exploring? Could a socially and environmentally just technocracy, deploying advanced technologies to save our species and many others, be the 21st century application of Aldo Leopold's land ethic? A thing is right when it tends to promote the complexity and integrity of a biotic system. Careful listeners will note I changed a word. I replaced stability with complexity. These are the only genuine ideas, Gasset once said, the ideas of the shipwrecked. Perhaps, like me, you feel shipwrecked. Whether these ideas are any good is part of the experiment of this quest. But if I see one more story about record heat answered by a street protest, I think I'll go to the mall to buy some hiking boots. A few years ago, I was floored to hear a venture capitalist, one of those individuals environmentalists point to as the problem, make the following remark about the international climate negotiations at Copenhagen. He said, "I went to Copenhagen and I lost the will to live. Even the rich are despairing. It seems time to find something other than failure." Most of the environmental progress we've seen has occurred in the 20th century. Cleaner air, cleaner water, banning DDT, fuel efficiency standards, and so on. These are set-aside and draw-down paradigms. Set aside wilderness under the Wilderness Act, draw down ozone-killing CFCs after the Montreal Protocol. But set-asides and drawdowns aren't working fast enough. They never could. We can't set aside portions of the sky to create a Holocene atmosphere global park. At Kyoto, site of the first international agreement on climate change, the director of the Climate Action Network told Time magazine of the hard-won treaty, quote, "It's disappointing in terms of what it will do for the environment, but we have a legally binding document. That's a start." Some 20 years later, CO2 emissions are up to record levels, and the consequences of climate change have spiked by about 30%. Every Al Gore Skyped climate lecture, every Bill McKibben organized climate rally, every I'm chained to a congressman's door protest, and I've done these myself, every Naomi Klein book or article is another moment of admirable civic engagement and another admission of timely failure. Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, my Prius named Astro failed. Today, staring at a rain-scrubbed blue sky above the rapidly warming American Southwest, through which flows the shrinking Colorado, I keep thinking of something the painter Francis Picabia once said. He said, "Heads are round, so thoughts can change direction." When I wrote my book about extinct North American birds, I said we needed to redefine hope from wish to work. I had no idea then that perhaps the only things that will work fast enough to cool the planet right now and buy us time to go to zero carbon and possibly restore important portions of the Holocene biosphere are right out of science fiction. Annalee Newitz writes in a book called Scatter, Adapt, Remember, How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction, that if we're going to make it in the long term and preserve our planet along with us, we need to accept that change is the status quo. To survive this far, we've had to change dramatically over time, and we'll have to change even more, remolding our world, our cities, and even our bodies. We need, she says, not hope, but pragmatic optimism. If we had 300 years before the worst effects of climate change manifested themselves, I'd align myself with attempts to overturn capitalism and intensify socially conscious technological approaches to minimize our damage to our species and the non-human world. But we have more like 30 years, and capitalism won't be overturned in my lifetime. Reined in, redirected, refocused, I hope, but it's not going anywhere soon, and the worst of the climate change is underway. That leaves us with the need to govern for and possibly deploy rapid technologies that can give us more time to get this right. Two researchers at the University of Melbourne have written in a recent study, it seems unlikely that the quest for ever-increasing growth can continue unchecked to 2100 without causing serious negative effects, and these effects might come sooner than we think. It may be too late to convince the world's politicians and wealthy elites to chart a different course, so to the rest of us, maybe it's time to think about how we protect ourselves. And here, in order to get through in time, I'm not going to talk in specifics about these technologies, but I have sort of snapshots of the arguments for and against them, and again, sort of situating myself in this place of ambivalence of trying to listen to the different arguments about the technologies that I will be writing about. But let me conclude with, again, a more personal section of this opening. Once again, the heat breaks a record and is therefore a broken record. Nothing lasts. In the desert where I live, predictions of mega drought and the blur of bird wings over migrants skirting highways. In the Rocky Mountain Canyon where I also live for part of the year, predictions of a wetter world. The line between Denver and San Francisco is a new border. North of that, warm and wet. South, hot and dry. Our world is warmer, stranger, and faster. It demands that we consider what was previously unthinkable, cultivating in ourselves the humility of a naturalist and the boldness of an engineer. This is an exploration, then, not only of tool and decision-making, but of textures. In a fundamental way, I'm trying to write about how we fill our time. The existential challenge we all face. If everything dies, why get up in the morning? So here's a story to end on, one to carve on rock or put on the page or say aloud. There's a giant who holds up the world. Once, a different hero needed to steal golden apples from a goddess. Unable to do this, he asked the giant to do the deed. This hero, his name was Hercules, shouldered the world while the giant Atlas rubbed his neck. He was tired of holding up the world. It's exhausting holding up the world. For Atlas, it had been punishment for siding against Zeus in the war with the Titans. After Atlas steals the apples and makes it clear he's done holding up the world, Hercules slyly asks him to take the planet back so he can pad his shoulders before resuming the ceaseless job. Being more brawn than brain, Atlas humped the earth back up on his shoulders again, where it remains. Hercules took off. Early cartographers always showed Atlas in this way. That's why collections of maps are called atlases. The task of navigating the world has always been linked to how it's held, how it's carried, and who does the heavy lifting. And today, it's far more than one. Any good history, writes Richard White, begins in strangeness. The past should not be comfortable. The past should be so strange that you wonder how you and people you know and love could come from such a time. When you have traced that trajectory, you have learned something. I want to learn something, but I already know this. We can't draw maps with trembling hands. Thank you.